Please, he's only a baby." The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they seemed to hang in the air longer than the cries that had filled the waiting room for nearly 20 minutes. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold glow across rows of plastic chairs, exhausted faces, and half-finished cups of vending machine coffee. A television mounted in the corner played a daytime talk show with the volume muted, its bright colors clashing with the tension settling over the room. Somewhere down the hall, an intercom crackled. A nurse hurried past. A clock ticked loudly against the wall. And through it all, the sound of a baby crying continued to echo across St. Matthew Medical Center. Emily Carter sat near the far end of the waiting room, gently rocking her 14-month-old son in her arms. Noah's tiny face was flushed red. His blonde hair clung damply to his forehead. Every few seconds, his small body trembled with another cry, the kind that came not from stubbornness or fatigue, but from genuine discomfort. Emily adjusted the thin blanket wrapped around him and kissed the top of his head. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself anymore. 3 nights. 3 nights without real sleep. 3 nights watching his fever rise and fall. 3 nights checking his breathing every hour because she was terrified of what might happen if she closed her eyes too long. Her own eyes burned from exhaustion. Her shoulders ached. The coffee she had bought 2 hours earlier had long gone cold beside her chair. Across the room, a man glanced up from his phone and sighed loudly. A woman shifted uncomfortably and crossed her arms. Another patient rubbed his temples. No one said anything directly. Not yet. But the irritation was becoming impossible to miss. Emily lowered her gaze. She knew the look. She had seen it before on crowded buses, inside grocery stores, in pharmacies, anywhere a tired mother struggled to calm a child in public. She bounced Noah gently. She sang softly under her breath. She tried everything she could think of. Nothing worked. His cries continued. Near the entrance, automatic doors slid open and closed. As people came and went, rain tapped softly against the glass outside. The parking lot reflected the pale hospital lights like a sheet of dark water. At the center of the waiting room, several people watched the reception desk, hoping their names would be called next. Others stared at their phones. Most avoided eye contact altogether. Then a voice broke the silence. "Can't somebody do something about that, baby?" The comment wasn't shouted. In some ways, that made it worse. Several heads turned. Emily froze. Her cheeks flushed immediately. Noah cried again. The woman who had spoken shook her head and returned to scrolling through her phone. Nobody defended Emily. Nobody offered help. The room simply accepted the remark and moved on. Emily swallowed hard. She looked down at Noah and tightened her hold around him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to anymore. What nobody noticed was the man sitting alone near the private consultation corridor. He looked older than most of the patients around him. Early 60s perhaps. Well-dressed, though not flashy. Gray suit. Polished shoes. Silver hair neatly combed back. He sat quietly with his hands folded, saying nothing. He hadn't touched the coffee beside him. He hadn't looked at his phone once. And unlike everyone else in the room, he wasn't staring at the crying baby with annoyance. He was watching the mother. Watching the way she checked Noah's forehead every few seconds. Watching the way she hid her fear behind tired smiles. Watching the way she apologized to strangers for a situation completely beyond her control. The man's name was William Harrison. Most people knew him as Chairman Harrison, the leader of one of the largest healthcare organizations in the country. But tonight, nobody recognized him. And for the moment, he preferred it that way. Another cry echoed through the room. William's eyes moved toward the child. Then toward the hospital wristband wrapped around Noah's tiny arm. Something about it caught his attention immediately. His expression changed. Just slightly. Almost imperceptibly. He leaned forward in his chair. For the first time all evening, his gaze remained fixed on the little wristband. The cries continued. The waiting room remained restless. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Inside, something had just shifted, and nobody knew it yet. Emily Carter had always believed that if she worked hard enough, stayed polite enough, and sacrificed enough, life would eventually ease its grip on her. Lately, however, that belief felt harder to hold on to. She shifted Noah gently against her shoulder and glanced toward the reception desk again. The same names continued appearing on the digital screen. The same nurses moved through the hallway. The same clock on the wall seemed determined to make every minute feel longer than the last. For hours earlier, she had been standing behind the counter of a small grocery store on the east side of town, finishing a double shift she had picked up because another employee called out sick. For hours before that, she had been cleaning offices in a downtown building before sunrise. Most mornings began before 5 o'clock. Most nights ended after midnight. The schedule was exhausting, but it paid the rent on her tiny two-bedroom apartment and kept food in the refrigerator. Barely. When Noah first developed a fever 3 days ago, she had hoped it was nothing serious. Children got sick. Everyone told her that. Give him fluids. Let him rest. Monitor his temperature. She followed every instruction she could find. She sat beside his crib through the night. She placed cool washcloths on his forehead. She counted every breath. She whispered every prayer she knew. But instead of improving, Noah seemed weaker each day. His appetite disappeared. His energy faded. Even his cries had changed. A mother's instincts often noticed things that charts and numbers could not. And Emily knew something was wrong. The problem was that being worried did not make medical bills disappear. She had delayed coming to the hospital longer than she wanted to admit. Not because she did not care. Because she cared so much that every decision carried consequences. Missing work meant losing income. Losing income meant overdue rent. Overdue rent meant risking everything she had fought to keep. Still, when Noah's fever climbed again that afternoon, she grabbed her keys, packed a diaper bag, and drove straight to St. Matthew Medical Center. She had expected long waits. She had expected paperwork. What she had not expected was the feeling of becoming invisible. Another cry escaped Noah's lips. Softer this time. Emily's stomach tightened. The quieter cries worried her more than the loud ones. She pressed her hand gently against his cheek. His skin still felt too warm. Nearby, a young couple stood when their name was called and disappeared behind a set of swinging doors. Emily watched them go before lowering her eyes. Beside the reception desk, a sign promised compassionate care for every patient. Tonight those words felt strangely distant. Across the room, William Harrison remained silent. He had spent decades building hospitals, funding research programs, and sitting through countless board meetings where executives discussed efficiency, patient satisfaction, and community trust. Yet sitting in this waiting room, he found himself paying attention to details that never appeared in quarterly reports. The exhaustion in a mother's eyes. The way fear made people shrink into themselves. The loneliness that could exist even in a crowded room. His gaze drifted back toward Noah's hospital wristband. There was a small colored marker attached near the identification tag. Most people would never notice it. William did. His expression hardened slightly. Not with anger. With concern. He looked toward the reception area. Then toward the hallway leading deeper into the hospital. Something was not adding up. Meanwhile, Emily reached into her diaper bag, searching for Noah's favorite stuffed rabbit. She found it tucked between baby wipes and medical paperwork. The toy's ears were worn from constant use. She placed it gently against Noah's chest. For a brief moment, his tiny fingers curled around it. Emily smiled through her exhaustion. Then his eyes slowly closed. The smile vanished immediately. The waiting room suddenly felt much colder. And from across the room, William Harrison sat forward in his chair. The waiting room seemed to stretch endlessly around Emily Carter as she shifted slightly. In her chair, careful not to jostle Noah, the soft hum of the air conditioning mixed with the rhythmic tapping of a nurse's shoes against the linoleum floor. Every tick of the clock on the far wall marked a minute that felt impossibly long. Emily's eyes darted to the automatic doors, half hoping the pediatric team would appear, half dreading being turned away again. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung in the air, mingling with the faint aroma of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby machine. Parents and patients alike tried to occupy themselves, some scrolling through their phones, others whispering quietly, but every few seconds the quiet was shattered by the sound of a baby whimpering or crying, a reminder of urgency that could not be ignored. Emily adjusted the small blanket over Noah once more, pressing her cheek to his warm forehead, feeling the rapid thrum of his tiny heart under her palm. Her hands shook slightly from a combination of fatigue and worry, and she whispered reassuringly, her voice soft but firm. "It is okay, Noah, Mommy is right here." Her words barely traveled beyond the space immediately surrounding them. Yet for a brief moment, his eyes fluttered open, and she saw a glimmer of recognition, a fragile comfort that made her heart tighten. Nearby, a receptionist glanced up and muttered something to another staff member, their faces a mixture of impatience and concern, but no immediate action came. Emily could sense the mounting tension from the other families in the room, the subtle shifts in posture, the sighs, the barely audible complaints. She tried to remain composed, knowing that panic would not help her son, and yet every minute that passed felt like an eternity. Across the room, William Harrison continued to observe, his sharp gray eyes tracking the small details others overlooked. He noticed the tremor in Emily's hands as she adjusted Noah's blanket, the careful, repeated rocking, the soft hum of lullabies muttered under her breath, the way she swallowed back tears, refusing to let her own emotions overwhelm the child. For someone who had spent decades making decisions in boardrooms and overseeing hospitals, this was a different kind of observation, one that no report or chart could convey. His gaze lingered on the faint wristband around Noah's arm, the subtle discoloration from a slightly high temperature that could indicate the early onset of a more serious condition. Something within him stirred, a memory, a long-buried concern that made him sit straighter in his chair. He could see not just the exhaustion and fear, but the unwavering determination of a mother who had already given more than most would ever ask. Emily shifted again, realizing that Noah's whimpers were becoming more insistent, the high-pitched tones cutting through the waiting room noise like a small alarm bell. Her heart raced. She murmured apologies under her breath, feeling the weight of every glance from other patients and staff. The sound of shoes on linoleum signaled someone approaching, and Emily lifted her gaze briefly to see a young nurse with a clipboard navigating the chairs, eyes momentarily softening when she noticed the tiny bundle in Emily's arms. Emily offered a tired smile, too weary to speak. She watched as the nurse paused just beyond the reach of the mother's desperate hope, consulting her notes and tapping the clipboard gently. Time seemed to slow, each second drawn out with the subtle tremors of anticipation and unease. Noah stirred again, squirming slightly, and Emily felt the gentle pressure of his tiny hand clutching hers, an instinctive connection that reminded her why she endured every hardship. William Harrison observed the interaction, his mind noting the balance between urgency and composure, fear and resolve, and he understood, without words, that this small, seemingly ordinary moment held within it the gravity of life and the tenderness of human endurance. The waiting room, once a space of neutral observation and passive discomfort, now seemed imbued with a quiet tension that was almost tangible, an invisible thread connecting mother, child, and the silent witness in the corner, all bound by a shared awareness of vulnerability and the potential for hope that had not yet been realized. Emily Carter felt her chest tighten as another wave of heat passed through Noah, making his small body tremble once more against her shoulder. The waiting room felt heavier now, every tick of the wall clock echoing the tension that seemed to ripple through the fluorescent-lit space. Parents and staff alike moved with measured steps, some sneaking glances at the mother and child, others pretending not to notice, as if ignoring discomfort could somehow make it disappear. Emily brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, the dampness from worry and exhaustion clinging stubbornly to her skin, and she whispered again to Noah, her words fragile but determined. "I am right here, Noah. We are going to be okay." Her voice barely carried beyond the space of her immediate surroundings, yet the strength in it was unmistakable, a quiet declaration against the relentless rhythm of waiting. Across the room, William Harrison leaned slightly forward in his chair, eyes never leaving the pair. He observed the careful way Emily adjusted Noah's blanket, how she tilted her head to catch his fleeting expressions, how she pressed her lips to his temple in gentle reassurance. William had spent decades managing hospitals, chairing boards, and reviewing countless patient reports, but none of his years of oversight could substitute for this kind of insight, the subtle reading of human need expressed in the quietest of gestures. He noticed the pattern of her movements, the repetition that spoke not of habit alone but of anxiety, of vigilance, of a deep-seated fear for the child in her arms. Every so often, Emily's gaze flicked toward the nurse's station, hoping to catch someone's attention, yet every time she did, it was met with a distracted nod or a hurried smile that failed to mask impatience. The ambient sounds of the waiting room, The distant intercom crackling, the low hum of medical equipment, the muted conversations, interwove with Noah's intermittent whimpers, creating a tapestry of tension that wrapped tightly around Emily's exhausted senses. Her hands tightened around him instinctively as he shifted, and she adjusted her posture, trying to support his weight without letting it be obvious how drained she truly was. From his corner seat, William's gaze moved to the small details. Others overlooked. The subtle way Noah's fingers curled against his mother's hand, the flutter of his eyelids, the faint rise and fall of his chest that carried both vulnerability and resilience. He considered the invisible pressure she carried, the balancing act of motherhood, financial strain, and her instinctive drive to protect her child above all else. Emily, feeling the weight of the waiting room's collective attention, whispered another lullaby, a melody she had hummed countless nights at home, a sound intended to anchor both herself and Noah amidst the chaos of uncertainty. The rhythm of her voice, soft but steady, seemed to momentarily calm him, and she allowed herself a brief breath, feeling the warmth of his small body settle against hers. She glanced toward the entrance again, half expecting someone to arrive, half fearing disappointment. The nurse moved past, clipboard in hand, pausing briefly as if sensing the intensity of Emily's gaze, yet continuing on with a polite, practiced smile. William Harrison noted every exchange, every hesitation, and the subtle acknowledgement in the nurse's quickened pace. His mind cataloged the patterns of behavior, the inefficiency and oversight in the system, and the small but critical moments of human endurance that too often went unnoticed. Emily adjusted Noah's tiny blanket one final time, pressing her cheek against his forehead and closing her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the exhaustion, the worry, and the faint surge of hope that perhaps someone who could make a difference was watching, waiting, and would act. In that moment, the waiting room felt suspended between despair and possibility, a delicate balance that neither Emily nor William could yet fully control, but one that pulsed with the quiet promise of change. The moment Emily Carter felt Noah's body suddenly grow heavier in her arms, a cold wave of fear rushed through her chest. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. In fact, it was the opposite. The crying that had filled the waiting room for hours began to fade. Noah's tiny fingers loosened around the worn stuffed rabbit. His eyelids drooped. His small head settled against her shoulder with an unusual stillness that every parent instinctively recognizes. Emily immediately sat up straighter. "Noah," she whispered softly. Her voice trembled despite her efforts to remain calm. She gently brushed his cheek. "Hey, sweetheart. Look at Mommy." For a second, his eyes fluttered open. Then they drifted closed again. Emily's heart began pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The waiting room around her seemed to blur. The muted television, the squeaking wheels of a passing cart, the low conversations. Everything faded beneath the weight of a mother's fear. She stood up quickly, clutching Noah against her chest. Her exhausted legs nearly gave way beneath her. She approached the reception desk once more. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "My son is getting worse." The receptionist barely glanced up from the computer screen. "A nurse will call you when they are available." Emily swallowed hard. "Please. He has been running a fever for days. He is not responding like before." The woman offered a polite but distracted smile. "I understand your concern, ma'am. We are doing the best we can." It was the kind of answer that sounded professional but solved nothing. Emily looked down at Noah. The fear she had been fighting all night finally reached the surface. Her eyes filled with tears, not because she wanted sympathy, not because she was weak, because she was watching the person she loved most in the world slip further beyond her ability to help. She stepped away from the counter and sat back down, holding Noah close. The tears came quietly, one after another. She pressed her forehead against his soft hair and closed her eyes. "Please be okay," she whispered. "Please." Nobody in the room spoke. Some looked away. Others stared down at their phones. The silence felt heavier than any noise. Across the room, William Harrison watched everything. He saw the receptionist return to her screen. He saw Emily sitting alone with tears rolling down her face. He saw the child lying limp against her shoulder. Most importantly, he saw something nobody else appeared to notice. The colored marker attached to Noah's wristband. Years ago, William had helped. implement a patient monitoring protocol across several hospitals within his healthcare network. Different markers signaled different levels of concern. Most visitors would never understand their meaning. Most patients never noticed them. But William knew exactly what that marker represented. His jaw tightened. He looked toward the nurse's station, then back at Noah. A memory surfaced from deep within him. Not a board meeting, not a financial report, a hospital room, 30 years earlier. Bright lights, a small bed, a frightened father sitting helplessly beside a child. The memory arrived without warning and settled heavily in his chest. William blinked once and returned to the present. Emily's shoulders shook slightly as she tried to compose herself. She was doing everything she could not to fall apart. William had met world leaders, billionaires, and powerful executives throughout his life. Yet at that moment, the strongest person in the building was a tired mother who refused to stop fighting for her child. Noah stirred weakly. Emily immediately wiped her tears and forced a smile. "There you are," she whispered. "You keep fighting, okay?" Her voice cracked on the final word. William slowly stood from his chair. The movement was so subtle that nobody paid attention. He adjusted his jacket and looked once more at the reception desk. Then he looked at Emily. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Emily did not know who he was. She only saw an older man with kind eyes. William gave the slightest nod before turning toward the hallway leading away from the waiting room. His expression had changed completely. The quiet observer was gone. In his place stood a man who had made difficult decisions for decades and knew exactly when waiting was no longer acceptable. William Harrison stepped into the hallway, the quiet determination in his stride contrasting with the tense energy that lingered in the waiting room. Each step echoed slightly against the polished tile floors, the sound crisp and deliberate, carrying with it an unspoken authority. Emily Carter watched him go, her gaze following the movement as though instinctively sensing a shift in the air. Her hands tightened. Around Noah, who had nestled his small head against her chest, breathing shallowly but steadier than moments before. The intercom crackled again, distant and mechanical, its announcement fading quickly into the hum of fluorescent lights. William reached the nearest phone station, a line connecting directly to the hospital director's office. He did not hesitate. He lifted the receiver with steady hands and pressed the buttons with precise force. His voice was calm, deliberate, yet carried a weight that could not be ignored. "Dr. Klein, come to the waiting room immediately. It is urgent." The words were not shouted. They were not demanding in the conventional sense. They were simple, concise, and impossible to dismiss. On the other end, a pause. Then a sharp intake of breath and a quiet, almost startled acknowledgement. William hung up, his gaze returning to the waiting room, aware that his action had set events in motion. In the waiting room, the subtle tension shifted. Emily sensed it even before anyone else did. She felt the air change, a slight flutter of anticipation brushing against the exhaustion she carried. The other patients and staff continued their routines, unaware that the ordinary flow of the evening was about to be disrupted. Emily adjusted Noah gently, whispering again, "Stay with me, sweet boy." She did not notice the faint nod of recognition William gave himself as he observed from the corridor entrance. Footsteps approached rapidly, measured but urgent. Dr. Robert Klein appeared at the end of the hall, his white coat flaring slightly with each stride. The director's eyes widened as he took in the sight before him. A mother holding a small child whose face betrayed both fever and fatigue, the subtle indicators of a potentially critical condition, and the rare presence of the chairman standing calmly nearby. William did not speak immediately. He simply gestured toward the reception desk and the waiting chairs, allowing Dr. Klein to take in the scene fully before speaking. The director's expression shifted, realization dawning slowly, then fully, and a quiet urgency entered his movements. He gestured to his nursing staff, and they moved with a renewed swiftness, checking charts, preparing equipment, and moving to assess Noah without unnecessary delay. Emily felt the difference instantly. The hurried efficiency, the careful attention, and the immediate focus on her child brought a sense of relief she had not dared to imagine moments earlier. She kept her voice soft, murmuring comforting words to Noah, watching as the nurses responded quickly to instructions and the doctor's attentive gaze. William observed from a slight distance, noting every detail, the shift in posture among the staff, the controlled but urgent steps of the director, and the subtle, almost imperceptible change in the energy of the room. He had not needed to shout, to demand, or to assert authority loudly. The room responded because the right person had recognized the weight of the moment, because the quiet power of observation, presence, and decisive action carried more force than any raised voice. Emily's eyes welled with tears again, but this time they were not only from fear or fatigue. They carried gratitude, relief, and the fragile hope that her son's cries would soon be met with the care he needed. Noah shifted in her arms, his small fingers curling lightly around her thumb, a small sign of life and resilience. William remained in the background, a silent anchor, aware that the intervention had been enough to tilt the course of events, to shift the balance toward attention, care, and human connection. The waiting room, once a space of tension and inattention, now seemed infused with purposeful movement, a renewed sense of urgency tempered with calm, and the soft, steadfast presence of a mother who refused to be invisible. The change was immediate, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Within minutes of Dr. Robert Klein arriving in the waiting room, nurses who had been moving at an ordinary pace suddenly became focused and alert. Computer screens were checked again. Charts were reviewed. Quiet conversations took place behind the reception desk. The atmosphere that had felt slow and indifferent all evening now carried a sense of urgency. Emily Carter barely noticed any of it at first. Her entire world remained fixed on the little boy in her arms. One of the nurses knelt beside her chair and offered a reassuring smile. "Miss Carter, we are going to take Noah back now." For a second, Emily simply stared. The words felt almost unreal. After hours of waiting, after countless glances toward the reception desk, after fighting exhaustion and fear, someone was finally saying the words she had been desperate to hear. "Right now?" she asked quietly. The nurse nodded. "Right now." Emily felt tears sting her eyes again. This time she did not try to hide them. She carefully stood and followed the medical team down the hallway, clutching Noah close against her chest. As they disappeared through the double doors, several people in the waiting room watched silently. Some looked relieved for her. Others looked confused by the sudden change in attention. Across the room, William Harrison remained standing near the corridor entrance. He said nothing. He simply watched as mother and son were finally taken where they should have gone much earlier. 20 minutes later, Emily sat inside a small examination room. The bright overhead lights reflected against clean white walls. Medical equipment hummed softly nearby. Noah lay on the hospital bed while nurses checked his temperature, monitored his breathing, and recorded measurements. Emily sat beside him holding his tiny hand. Every movement from the staff felt reassuring. Every question they asked felt important. For the first time all night, she felt like somebody was listening. Dr. Klein entered the room personally. That alone surprised several members of the staff. Hospital directors rarely handled routine emergency evaluations themselves. Yet there he was, reviewing Noah's chart with careful attention. He examined the toddler quietly before exchanging a serious glance with another physician. Emily immediately noticed. A mother's eyes miss very little. "What is it?" she asked. "Please tell me the truth." Dr. Klein pulled up a chair. His voice remained calm and professional. "You brought him in at the right time." Emily's stomach tightened. "What does that mean?" The doctor folded his hands. "His condition requires immediate treatment. We need to run additional tests, but based on what we are seeing, waiting much longer could have created serious complications." Emily felt the air leave her lungs. She looked toward Noah and gently stroked his hair. The room suddenly felt smaller. The reality she had feared for days was now sitting directly in front of her. She had not overreacted. She had not imagined the warning signs. Her instincts had been right all along. Tears slipped down her cheeks as relief and fear collided inside her chest. Relief that he was finally receiving help. Fear of what might have happened if she had listened to the voices telling her to wait longer. Meanwhile, word had begun spreading quietly throughout the hospital. Staff members whispered to one another in hallways. Receptionists exchanged nervous looks. Nurses straightened their posture whenever William Harrison appeared. The realization moved from department to department with astonishing speed. The chairman of Harrison Medical Group had been sitting in the waiting room for hours. Watching, observing, listening. Not during a scheduled tour. Not during a prepared inspection. During a normal evening when nobody knew he was there. Some employees suddenly remembered conversations they wished they had handled differently. Others reviewed patient logs with growing concern. In one office, a supervisor quietly closed her door and began making phone calls. Back in Noah's room, Emily knew none of this. She was too focused on the child lying beside her. She kissed his forehead and whispered softly, "You are going to be okay." Noah opened his eyes slightly and squeezed her finger. It was a tiny gesture, barely noticeable, yet it felt bigger than anything else in the world. Outside the room, William Harrison stood alone at the end of the hallway. Through the small window in the door, he could see the mother sitting beside her son. His expression softened, because the truth was, he had not seen a policy failure that evening. He had seen something far more personal. He had seen a frightened parent desperately trying to protect her child. And 30 years ago, he had once been that parent himself. An hour later, the atmosphere inside St. Matthew Medical Center felt completely different. The frantic uncertainty that had shadowed Emily Carter for days was slowly giving way to cautious hope. Noah had received treatment. His temperature had begun to come down. Monitors displayed steadier readings. Nurses checked on him regularly. And for the first time since arriving at the hospital, Emily was able to take a full breath without feeling panic squeeze her chest. She sat beside his bed, her fingers gently intertwined with his tiny hand. The exhaustion remained, but now it carried relief instead of helplessness. Noah stirred slightly and opened his eyes. The faintest smile appeared on his face before he drifted back into sleep. Emily lowered her head and quietly cried. Not from fear this time, from gratitude. A soft knock came at the door. Emily quickly wiped her eyes and looked up. Dr. Robert Klein entered with a warm expression. Behind him stood the older gentleman she had noticed earlier in the waiting room. The same man who had looked at her with kindness when everything felt hopeless. Emily immediately straightened in her chair. "Is everything okay?" she asked. Dr. Klein smiled. "Everything is moving in the right direction." Emily nodded and looked toward Noah. "Thank God." There was a brief silence before Dr. Klein glanced toward the man standing beside him. His expression shifted slightly, as though he was about to reveal something important. "Ms. Carter," he said carefully, "there is someone I believe you should properly meet." Emily looked confused. The older man offered a polite smile. "Hello, Emily." "Hello," she replied. Dr. Klein cleared his throat. "This is William Harrison." Emily waited politely. The name sounded familiar, but exhaustion prevented her from immediately making the connection. Then realization slowly appeared across her face. Her eyes widened. "William Harrison?" she repeated. "The chairman?" Dr. Klein nodded. Emily stared at him in disbelief. Harrison Medical Group owned dozens of hospitals across the country. His name appeared in business magazines, healthcare reports, and charitable foundations. Yet the man standing in front of her looked nothing like the powerful executive she had imagined. He looked like an ordinary grandfather. Calm, thoughtful, human. "You were in the waiting room," Emily said quietly. William smiled. "I was." Emily looked from him to Dr. Klein and back again. Pieces of the evening suddenly began fitting together. The sudden attention, the director's arrival, the change in urgency. Her voice nearly disappeared into a whisper. "You helped us." William shook his head gently. "No, the doctors and nurses are helping your son." Emily looked down. "But none of it would have happened when it did if you had not stepped in." William remained silent for a moment. Then he slowly approached Noah's bedside. His eyes rested on the sleeping child. A softness entered his expression that Emily had not seen before. It was not the look of a chairman. It was the look of a father remembering something painful. "There is something you should know," William said quietly. The room grew still. Even Dr. Klein remained silent. William looked at Noah's wristband. "When I was younger, I had a son." Emily listened carefully. William's voice remained steady, but there was emotion beneath every word. 30 years ago, he became seriously ill. We brought him to a hospital. We thought there was time. He paused briefly. There was not. Emily's hand immediately moved to her mouth. William continued looking at Noah. "I spent years blaming myself, wondering what I could have done differently, wondering whether one decision, one conversation, one moment might have changed everything." His eyes never left the sleeping child. "Tonight, when I saw your son sitting in that waiting room, I noticed the marker attached to his wristband." Emily glanced at the band around Noah's arm. "I knew what it meant," William said. "And for a moment, I felt like I was looking at the past." The room fell completely silent. Emily felt tears forming again. Not because of what William had done, because she suddenly understood why he had done it. This was never about power. It was never about authority. It was about a wound that had never fully healed. William finally looked toward her. I could not save my own child. His voice softened. But I was not going to stand there and watch another parent feel invisible. Emily's tears flowed freely now. The room no longer felt like a hospital room. It felt like two lives crossing paths at exactly the moment they needed to. One carrying the fear of losing a child, the other carrying the memory of having lost one. And in that quiet space between grief and hope, neither of them felt alone anymore. 3 weeks later, the rain had disappeared from the city, replaced by bright spring sunlight that poured through the large windows of St. Matthew Medical Center. The same hospital that had once felt cold and distant now looked very different. New signs had been installed throughout the emergency department. Additional pediatric triage procedures had been implemented. Staff training programs had been expanded. Several policy reviews were underway. What had begun as one difficult evening had quietly sparked meaningful change. Yet the most important difference could not be found in a report or a policy manual. It could be seen in a small boy laughing as he sat in his mother's lap. Noah Carter looked like a completely different child. The fever was gone. The exhaustion had disappeared from his bright blue eyes. His favorite stuffed rabbit rested beside him as he happily reached toward a colorful toy placed on a nearby table. Emily Carter watched him with a smile she had not worn in months. Some smiles come from happiness. Others come from relief. Hers came from both. She still worked hard. She still faced challenges. Life had not magically become perfect. But every morning, she woke up grateful for something she would never take for granted again. Her son was healthy. A gentle knock sounded at the open door. Emily looked up and immediately recognized William Harrison standing in the hallway. Noah's face brightened. During the past few weeks, William had checked on him several times. The bond between the elderly chairman and the toddler had formed naturally, built through simple visits, quiet conversations, and small moments of kindness. Well, William said with a smile, you look like you have recovered faster than most adults. Noah laughed and held up his stuffed rabbit as if offering proof. Emily stood and greeted him warmly. It is good to see you again. William nodded. I wanted to stop by before my meeting. They talked for several minutes while Noah happily played nearby. Then William handed Emily a small folder. She looked at it curiously. What is this? William sat down across from her. After that night, I spent a lot of time thinking. Emily listened quietly. I realized something important, he continued. Hospitals are built to treat illnesses. But sometimes people need help long before they reach a hospital bed. Emily slowly opened the folder. Inside were documents outlining a new foundation. Her eyes widened as she read. The program would provide emergency medical assistance for low-income families with young children, transportation support, immediate pediatric assessments, financial guidance, resources for parents facing impossible choices between healthcare and basic living expenses. Emily looked up in disbelief. You created this? William smiled softly. No, he glanced toward Noah. We created it. Emily's eyes filled with tears. William shook his head gently. That night reminded me why these hospitals exist. Not for numbers. Not for rankings. For people. The room grew quiet. Outside the window, sunlight reflected against nearby buildings. Inside, 3 lives sat together connected by one evening that none of them would ever forget. Later that afternoon, William prepared to leave. Before stepping into the hallway, he paused beside Noah. The little boy reached up and wrapped his tiny arms around the chairman's leg. William laughed softly and gently patted his shoulder. Take care of your mother, he said. Noah grinned as though he understood every word. Emily walked William to the elevator. As the doors opened, she looked at him and asked a question she had wondered about ever since that night. Why did you stay? William considered the question for a moment. Then he smiled. Because someone should have stayed for my son. The elevator doors slowly closed. Emily stood there watching until they disappeared. Years later, hospital employees would still talk about the evening a chairman sat unnoticed in a waiting room. Some remembered the policy changes. Others remembered the surprise inspections that followed. But the people who truly understood the story remembered something else. A tired mother, a sick child, and one man who refused to look away. Because power is not measured by the office you occupy or the title on your door. It is measured by what you do when someone vulnerable needs your help. William Harrison could not change the past. He could not return to the hospital room that had broken his heart 30 years earlier. But on one ordinary evening, he gave another family something priceless. A second chance. And sometimes, that is the closest thing to healing that life allows.